The next one we're going to talk about our thyroid hormone pathway. We start in the hypothalamus with releasing thyrotropin releasing hormone, causes the pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, causes the thyroid tissue to release different thyroid hormones. There's different varieties of them. We call T3 and T4 are the main ones. Those are then going through the system to the secondary tissue, which in this case is mainly the muscles and liver. Taking a look at that, what is thyroid hormone really doing for us is that it's controlling our metabolic rate and our energy use, and it's controlling growth and tissue differentiation. So this is the first one that we're talking about that is amino acid derived. It's not a steroid hormone. And you'll see when you talk about it in more detail later, it has a requirement for iodide in order to be generated. The major effects of thyroid hormone are going to be, like I said, metabolic rate and energy use. So it's going to increase basic cellular metabolic rate, increasing glucose utilization, increasing production of ATP and oxygen burning, and increase in body temperature. The second thing that it's doing is it's going to potentiate the sympathetic nervous system. So you're going to increase your heart rate, increase respiration, and increase cardiac output. So all of those, when you think about them, are what you would consider energy balance and metabolism. There's also some growth and developmental functions like increasing bone and muscle growth, as well as changes in neuronal development. So again, this was a pretty simple one. You have the hypothalamus, released thyrotropin releasing hormone onto the pituitary, which releases thyroid stimulating hormone onto the thyroid, which releases T3 and T4 onto basically every cell in the body. Got to have that negative feedback, and we're good to go. The next one we're going to talk about is growth hormone. Here we have the hypothalamus with growth hormone releasing hormone, causes the pituitary to release growth hormone. That then acts on growth hormone receptors on the liver and causes release of insulin-like growth factor. So that's something that's important to remember. You'll talk about this more, but insulin-like growth factor is really that hormone C, the one that goes and acts on the secondary tissues. So a lot of times when we talk about growth hormone, we talk about it like that's the final hormone, like when we say cortisol or thyroid hormone or testosterone. In fact, growth hormone really is still one of those intermediary hormones. So growth hormone, this one A, growth hormone B, insulin-like growth factor is C. And then that's going to go and affect muscles, the liver, and bone. We also call growth hormone somatotropin. And the reason for that is we have tissue or body is somato, and then tropin means growth. And so somatotropin is really, in a sense, the same thing as saying growth hormone. This is peptide hormone. So when you remember peptide hormones, you couldn't take them orally because they are going to be broken down by peptidases in your GI. And these also have growth factor functions. So insulin-like growth factor is then going to bind IGF-1 receptors. It's going to bind them on a couple different types of tissue. It can bind them on the bone and the muscle, in which it's going to act there as that growth factor, and it's going to cause cell proliferation. So that growth hormone is going to cause bone growth, and it's going to cause muscle growth. It also binds to receptors on fat cells or adipose tissue, and that's going to mobilize free fatty acids, and it's also going to increase blood glucose. So there's a lot of other cells with IGF-1 receptors. Growth hormone has a lot of effects. I'm just kind of breaking it down to these really basic ones. So what do you need to know from here? You need to know that the hypothalamus has this GHRH release, hits receptors in the pituitary that release growth hormone. Those hit the liver, which releases IGF-1, and then goes to the adipose tissue and goes to bone and muscle. There is a negative feedback pathway here, which isn't shown here because it was just getting too busy, but you are going to have that negative feedback like you would expect. One of the things about the growth hormone pathway is that it actually has a couple of other ways to get into the pituitary to modulate the pituitary response. So everything we've talked about so far is hypothalamus tells the pituitary to release, and the pituitary doesn't. But in this case, our body wanted to have a couple other ways to modulate it. So we have a hormone associated with eating and appetite and satiation called ghrelin. That is a positive effect here. Positive means it increases growth hormone release. And we have another hormone called somatostatin that has a negative effect, which means it decreases growth hormone release. So you can modulate this pathway either by looking at GHRH or by changing ghrelin or somatostatin. So you have multiple different pharmacological and physiological ways to hit this. So we have several disorders associated with growth hormone. We've got disorders of low growth hormone and disorders of high, as well as disorders in children versus adults. Now, one of the things that growth hormone was doing in children, adolescents, and young adults was that long bone growth. So basically height. And so one of the things that we see very clearly if a child has a low growth hormone levels is going to be decreased long bone growth and decreased height growth. This usually occurs because the hypothalamus or the pituitary are just not functioning well. They're just not releasing enough. And that causes what we call pituitary dwarfism. And that's going to be associated with just a very proportional decrease in bone length. So this is an example here. These folks, their body proportions are exactly the same as they would be if they had had a lot of growth hormone. It's just everything grew smaller. They also have an issue with delayed puberty. If you had increase of growth hormone in childhood, now you're going to have an increased length of bones because they're going to keep growing. And usually that's because there's a pituitary tumor that's causing oversecretion. And we call that giantism. In adults, we already have the bone growth. So basically the long bone growth is already done and stature has been completed. So in adults who lose growth hormone levels, it's usually because they have a damage to the pituitary. Sometimes people with TBIs get damage to the pituitary. So it doesn't change your growth in terms of height, but it does mean that you don't have the same metabolic functions in terms of the muscle remodeling and the cardiac output. So in adult growth hormone deficiency, more likely to see obesity, decreased muscle mass, and decreased cardiac output. If you have not enough growth hormone, you can just treat it with more growth hormone. So that's lovely. In the case of adults, you're not going to have any more lengthening of the long bones, so no additional height, but you can have thickening of bones as they're remodeling on a normal bone, reabsorption and reproduction modeling. You can thicken some of those bones, especially in the jaw, and especially in areas of cartilage can overgrow. And unfortunately, there's also enlargement of internal organs sometimes. So we call that condition acromegaly. And you don't have to memorize any of these pharmacological treatments, as I said, but low growth hormone, luckily we can give growth hormone analogs or growth hormone releasing hormone analogs. And then pharmacologically, we can treat excess growth hormone with lots of different things that can decrease that pathway. Like we can use somatostatin, or we can use growth hormone receptor antagonists. So there are a lot of different drug strategies we can do to get in there and normalize that. A lot of people are curious as to what the difference is between pituitary dwarfism and achondroplastic dwarfism. And the difference is that achondroplastic dwarfism doesn't have anything to do with growth hormone. So growth hormone levels are fine and growth hormone receptors are fine. It's actually due to a mutation in fibroblast growth factor, which is involved in converting cartilage to bone. So this isn't a completely proportional change. Some of the bones and tissues are growing at a normal rate, while other ones are having stunted growth. So when you see achondroplastic dwarfism, usually is somewhat unproportional, in which the torso and the head are usually normal sized or large, and then the arms, legs, and fingers tend to be shortened. This has completely normal pubertal development, and so there's really the only difference there is in terms of cartilage to bone structuring.